There's a big problem happening right now, and no one is taking it seriously. I'm calling it the unavailability question. There is a clear rise in individuals who keep attracting emotionally unavailable partners, and it doesn't look like it's getting any better. So the big question is, why does this keep happening, and how do you stop it? I mean, this isn't just bad luck. It's not random. And it's not just about them. I believe there's a hidden mechanism that keeps recreating this dynamic over and over again. And until you spot it, you're not just vulnerable to one unavailable partner, you're vulnerable to attracting all of them. Okay, bear with me here, because I promise this is going to connect to the unavailability question. But have you ever heard of the Goldilocks Zone in cooking? So in astronomy, of course, the Goldilocks Zone is this perfect distance from a star where life can actually survive. So if a planet is too close to the sun, everything burns. If it's too far, everything freezes, but just right and something can finally grow. Well, turns out cooking has its own Goldilocks zone. Think about taste for a moment. With something like salt, too much and the whole dish becomes inedible. Too little and it's bland, like it's missing something essential, but just the right amount and it wakes everything up. It enhances the flavor without really stealing the spotlight. Same with acid. Too much vinegar or lemon, it's sharp and overpowering. Too little, the dish tastes flat, like it's asleep. And the best meals, the ones people always remember, always live in this delicate middle zone. Not too much, not too little, but just right. Balanced, layered, and alive. So understanding the Goldilocks zone principle when it comes to taste and cooking will actually explain why you keep attracting emotionally unavailable partners. So right now, I pulled up a menu with 4 columns. Now, these columns are designed to show you something most people miss entirely. It's not whether you have these traits, it's how much of each you bring to the table. So the first column lists the ingredients. These are kind of like the core relational traits that either draw someone in or push them away. Think of them like the salt, spice, and acid of your emotional profile. The second column is what happens when there's too much of that ingredient, like dumping an entire tablespoon of salt into a single bite. It repels the right kind of partner, and it repels them pretty darn fast. The third column is what happens when there's too little. And this is the dangerous part, because being underseasoned doesn't just push everyone away, it actually attracts emotionally unavailable people. Why? Well, because low heat, low flavor, low confrontation feels safe for them, easy to control, easy to disappear from. And of course, you have the fourth column. That's the Goldilocks zone, the emotional flavor profile that's balanced, attractive, and sustainable. The one that naturally draws in emotionally available partners without having to chase them. So that's it, right? That's the video. Stick to column 4 and you are good. Well, not exactly. Because last time I checked, human beings can't be perfectly put into any of these columns. Here, I'll give you an example. You might have a solid self-worth, salt. You know what you deserve, but your spice is way off. You overshare on date 2 and trauma dump without realizing it. Or maybe you got like this really amazing warmth. People love being around you, but your boundaries are paper thin. You say yes when you mean no. You forgive too fast. You shrink to keep the peace. The truth is, most of us are walking around with one ingredient cranked too high and another one turned all the way down. And here's the crazy part. That imbalance isn't random. It's usually learned from childhood, from past relationships, from the stories that you've told yourself just to survive. But what about emotionally unavailable people? Well, one of the things that I specialize in on this channel is studying avoidant behavior. And it's interesting to me that avoidance, the most emotionally unavailable of the attachment styles, are consistently attracted to individuals who exhibit the qualities of column 2. Why? Well, because column 2 feels safe to them. Avoidants fear emotional engulfment. They fear being needed. They grew up in environments where closeness felt intrusive and unpredictable, sometimes even dangerous. So when they meet someone who undervalues themselves and avoids these hard conversations and lacks boundaries or stays vague and easygoing, it actually doesn't feel like a red flag to them. That feels like home. Column 2 people don't demand too much. They don't challenge the avoidance emotional distance. They don't force vulnerability. And so the avoidant doesn't feel pressure to open up, which basically means they can stay behind the wall and still call it a relationship. But here's the wildest part. The moment you start shifting towards column 4, that moment you finally begin to find your balance, the avoidant either evolves or they exit. That's when the whole unavailability question finally gets answered. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I'm aware of the fact that this Goldilocks Zone concept that I've come up with might anger some people. It might feel like I'm specifically pointing at you and saying, hey, it's your fault you attracted this super emotionally unavailable person. But most of the time, it's actually not, because where you fall on this menu throughout your life will change. You're not always column 2. You might be column 4 with your friends, but column 2 is someone you're deeply attracted to. You might hold boundaries at work, but completely lose them in a relationship where you fear being abandoned. The point is this: your flavor profile changes depending on your environment, your stress level, and your emotional history with the person in front of you. So what feels like you might just be a version of you shaped by fear, uncertainty, or unhealed patterns. And that's why awareness is so powerful, because once you notice which column you're sliding into, you can kind of course correct before the imbalance becomes your identity. Oh, but I haven't even gotten to the best part yet. My wife just did this really amazing video on dismissive avoidance where she talks about how dangerous it is to place a simple label on them. All right, so here's how her theory works. She calls it the Avoidant Spectrum, and it reframes everything we think we know about emotionally unavailable people. See, most people hear avoidant and imagine it's just one kind of person. But according to her, avoidants fall across 5 levels, from mildly guarded all the way up to emotionally frozen. Level 1 avoidants are barely noticeable. They need a little bit more space than usual. Maybe they hesitate during emotional moments, but they end up showing up. They're close to secure, just kind of like lightly armored. Level 2 avoidants are more noticeably uncomfortable with vulnerability. You'll see it in how they change the subject when things get emotional or flinch when you say something real, but they're still around, they're still trying. Level 3 avoidants live in the push-pull dynamic. One day they're deeply connected and then next they vanish. You feel like you're dating 2 people. It's inconsistent, but there's still hope, and most of the time they still do kind of come back. Level 4 avoidants start to shut down completely. Vulnerability doesn't just make them uncomfortable, it threatens them. They freeze during emotional conversations. They rewrite history. Their relationship starts to feel like a minefield. And then you have the level 5 avoidants. These are the ones who disappear without warning. No goodbye, there's no explanation. It's like they hit a trapdoor and just drop out of your life. Closeness doesn't just scare them, it's intolerable. It triggers a full nervous system collapse. Here's the part that I think is relevant for our discussion. Avoidants don't usually start at level 5. They slide there. And that's what makes them so dangerous. So let's have some fun with this. I've introduced 2 concepts to you. You have the Goldilocks menu, and then you have sort of this avoidant spectrum. Really, they go hand in hand. Let's use the Goldilocks menu for a moment to demonstrate what a typical person who just wants to find love looks like at the beginning of a relationship. You'll notice that 4 of the 7 ingredients are in the correct, just right column, and the rest are scattered between the too little and too much columns. So let's say that you meet someone who's a level 1 avoidant. They're a little bit guarded, but they're charming. They're not running yet, they're texting back, they're sleeping over. So you sit there and think, okay, I can work with this. And for a while, things are great. There's connection, there's momentum, there's chemistry. But as the relationship starts to get more serious, emotional pressure begins to build. Now, when that occurs, one of 2 things is going to start to happen. First, they start sliding up the avoidance spectrum. Level 1 becomes level 2. They get quiet during vulnerable conversations. They pull away after emotional closeness. You can feel the shift. It's subtle at first, but undeniable. Second, you actually start shifting too. The ingredients that were once in the Goldilocks zone, your self-worth, your warmth, your boundaries, they start drifting out of balance. Why? Well, because you're responding to their withdrawal. So you turn up the sugar to compensate, you over-communicate to make up for their silence, you downplay your needs to avoid triggering them, you become overly curious about their emotional state while abandoning your own. Boundaries start to blur, self-worth takes a hit, vulnerability becomes overexposure. You get the idea. Now, before you realize it, your entire menu has shifted. Every ingredient now lives in either the too much or the too little column. One of the most common complaints you'll hear from people who end up dating an emotionally unavailable person is they'll usually say something along the lines of, I feel like I'm a different person, or I feel like I've lost myself. Well, what's really happening, I think, is they were initially sitting in that Goldilocks taste zone, but over time, that shifts. This is how the system breaks down. It's not all at once. It's not in some dramatic, observable collapse. It happens slowly over time until the version of you that attracted them in the first place is completely gone. Oh, and here's the thing that no one says out loud. I actually don't think avoidants are attracted to anxious people, which seems to contradict what we always hear. Any search around YouTube is enough to tell you that the general consensus is that dismissive avoidance, an extremely emotionally unavailable person, is most commonly paired with an anxious, preoccupied attachment style. But I'm not convinced this is always the case at first. Really think about this. An avoidant is supposed to be someone who is always on guard against intimacy and closeness. An anxious attachment style is supposed to be someone who is overly emotionally intimate and open. And yet, they don't. They date them. They sleep next to them. They move in with them. They fall in love with them. So what is going on here? Here's my theory. The anxious person likely doesn't present as anxious at first. In fact, early on, they often seem like the perfect partner. They're warm, they're emotionally generous, they're open-hearted, they mirror well, they listen, they accommodate. They're often intuitive, socially gifted, and good at creating connection fast. And that, I think, initially draws an avoidant in. Not the anxiety, but this illusion of safety, of someone who isn't demanding, who seems chill, who lets them lead. Meanwhile, the anxious person may already slightly lean anxiously beneath the surface, but their anxiety doesn't fully activate until they start bonding. And that's when things unravel. The avoidant thinks, wait, where did this clingy, reactive person come from? And the anxious partner thinks, wait, why are you disappearing now that I'm finally being myself? But neither of them has really changed. I think they've just slid into their survival modes. Using my wife's spectrum, we can literally see the two attachment styles pulling apart as the relationship wears on. The longer I've done this, the more I've realized that often relationships reveal your emotional defaults under pressure. And in most cases, people don't consciously choose imbalance. They just end up sliding into it. Avoidants slide up the spectrum. Anxious attachers slide out of their Goldilocks zone. And the relationship that once felt like home now feels like a place where neither of you belong. So what's the big lesson? Well, it's this. Attraction happens fast, but imbalance happens slow. And if you don't stay aware of how your emotional menu is shifting, you won't notice that you've left the Goldilocks zone until it's already too late. But the good news is you can always course correct. You can always check your ingredients, recalibrate your portion sizes, bring yourself back to center, because the goal shouldn't be just to attract someone. It's to stay yourself after you do. And that, more than anything, is what makes you magnetic to the kind of love that can actually last.